The village of Thornvale lay shrouded in mist, as it had every morning, for as long as anyone could remember. Yet today, the fog seemed heavier, more oppressive, as if the very air wished to conceal the horror of what was to come. Ilara Blackwood stood at her bedroom window, watching droplets of condensation race down the glass like tears. Her own eyes remained dry. She had exhausted her capacity for weeping 3 days prior, when the Council of Elders had announced their decision. "The treaty must be honored," Elder Matthias had proclaimed, his voice echoing through the stone chamber. "The vampire realm has upheld their end for a century, protection from the werewolf clans, immunity from the plague that ravages the southern kingdoms. Our prosperity is built upon this covenant." In the front row, Ilara had felt her mother's hand tighten around hers until it became painful. "As dictated by the ancient agreement," Matthias continued, "when the vampire king takes the throne, a bride from our village shall be offered. The stars have aligned, King Dravius has ascended, and the sacred selection has been made." His rheumy eyes found Ilara's. "Ilara Blackwood shall be the bride." The memory dissolved as a knock at her door pulled Ilara back to the present. Without waiting for a response, her mother entered, carrying a gown of deepest crimson. "It's time to prepare," Margaret Blackwood said, her voice hollow. Once a woman of vibrant spirit, the past days had aged her visibly. Silver strands now dominated her once auburn hair, and lines carved deep channels beside her mouth. Ilara nodded mutely and allowed herself to be dressed like a doll. The gown was exquisite, heavy silk that whispered against the floorboards as she moved, embroidered with tiny black beads that caught what little light filtered through the windows. A bride's gown, but one that acknowledged the darkness of her destination. "The stories," Ilara finally spoke, her voice barely audible, "about the vampire king. Do you think any of them are true?" Margaret's hand stilled as she fastened the row of pearl buttons along Ilara's spine. "People speak of things they do not understand," she said carefully. "Fear breeds tales. They say he bathes in the blood of virgins to maintain his youth, that he can transform into 1,000 bats and devour a man's soul through his eyes." Ilara recited the horrors she'd heard whispered since childhood. "That his castle is decorated with the bones of his enemies and previous brides." "Superstitious nonsense," Margaret replied, but her fingers trembled against Ilara's back. "No one has seen any of the previous brides again," Ilara continued, voicing the thought that had kept her awake for 3 nights. "Once every century, a girl from Thornvale disappears into the northern mountains, never to return." Margaret spun her daughter around, gripping her shoulders. "Listen to me. You are the daughter of William Blackwood, the finest swordsman this village ever produced. My mother was a healer whose remedies saved hundreds. Strength and wisdom run in your blood." She pressed something cold and heavy into Ilara's palm. "Take this. Keep it hidden in your garments." Ilara looked down at a silver dagger, its handle inlaid with protective runes. "Mother, I cannot save you from this fate," Margaret whispered fiercely. "But I can give you a choice. If his cruelty becomes unbearable." She couldn't finish the thought. Ilara slipped the dagger into a hidden pocket, sewn into the gown's voluminous skirts. Its weight against her thigh was both frightening and comforting. The preparations continued in silence. Her hair, long waves the color of chestnuts in autumn, was intricately braided and adorned with black pearls. A veil of burgundy lace obscured her features. When she finally stood before the mirror, Ilara hardly recognized the solemn bride who stared back. Her naturally pale skin seemed almost translucent, making her green eyes appear unnaturally bright by contrast. "You look beautiful," her mother said, voice breaking on the final word. "I look like a sacrifice," Ilara replied. The tolling of the village bell signaled noon, the appointed time. From her window, Ilara could see the gathering in the square below. The entire village had assembled to witness her departure. At the edge of the crowd stood a black carriage drawn by 4 horses so dark they seemed to absorb the light around them. No driver was visible. "It's time," said a voice from the doorway. Elder Matthias stood there, leaning heavily on his cane, his ceremonial robes making him appear like a great black crow. The escort awaits. The walk from her family's modest home to the village square passed in a blur. Villagers lined the path, some weeping openly, others watching with solemn expressions that held relief poorly concealed. Relief that it was not their daughter being sent away. Ilara recognized faces she had known all her life. The baker who had given her sweet rolls when she was a child. The blacksmith who had taught her to forge a simple knife. Children she had once taught to read in the small village school. Now they all watched her procession as if she were already a ghost. At the square, the council of elders waited in a semicircle. In the center stood a tall figure, draped in a hooded cloak that concealed all features. The vampire emissary, sent to collect her. "People of Thornvale," Elder Matthias announced, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Today we honor the sacred covenant that has protected our lands for generations. Ilara Blackwood, daughter of our village, goes forth to fulfill her noble duty as bride to King Dravius, ruler of the northern realms and lord of the immortal court." Noble duty. The words rang hollow in Ilara's ears. There was nothing noble about being traded like cattle to ensure another year of prosperity. Yet she kept her head high, refusing to let the village see her break. If she must walk to her doom, she would do so with dignity. "Step forward, child," Matthias said. Ilara moved to stand before the hooded figure. Up close, she could sense an unnatural stillness about the emissary. No breath stirred the fabric of the cloak, no shifting of weight or subtle movements that betrayed humanity. "Do you accept your sacred duty to the covenant?" the elder asked her, as tradition demanded. For a moment, Ilara considered refusing. What would happen if she simply said no? Would the vampire emissary drag her away, screaming? Would the village force her? But looking at the faces around her, the fear, the sympathy, the relief, she knew her refusal would only postpone the inevitable and perhaps bring suffering to others. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The hooded figure extended a pale hand from within the folds of the cloak. The skin was alabaster white, the fingers elongated and adorned with a single ring of obsidian. Ilara placed her hand in the emissary's and immediately felt a chill seep through her skin and into her bones. The touch was cold as midwinter frost. Without a word, the emissary guided her toward the waiting carriage. The door opened of its own accord, revealing an interior lined with dark velvet. Ilara turned for one final look at her village, at her mother, whose composure had finally broken as silent tears streamed down her face, then stepped into the carriage. The emissary followed, sitting across from her. The door closed with a thud that sounded to Ilara like the sealing of a tomb. With no visible signal given, the horses began to move, their hooves striking the cobblestones in perfect unison. "How long is the journey?" Ilara asked, breaking the silence as the carriage passed through Thornvale's northern gate and onto the forest road. The emissary's hood turned slightly toward her. "We will arrive by nightfall," came the reply, a voice neither male nor female, but something in between, with a faint echo as if spoken from the depths of a cave. "King Dravius awaits your arrival with great anticipation." The thought made Ilara's stomach twist. "What is he like?" she ventured, searching for any information that might prepare her for what awaited. The emissary was silent so long that Ilara thought her question would go unanswered. Finally, it spoke. "It is not my place to describe the king. You will form your own impressions soon enough." "And what is to be my role beyond the obvious?" Ilara pressed, emboldened by desperation. "Am I to be his companion, his prisoner, his meal?" A sound emanated from beneath the hood, something that might have been laughter in another lifetime. "Curious little human. The king has had many brides throughout his long existence. Each found her own place in his realm. "And where are these previous brides now?" Elara asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "That is a question for the king," the emissary replied, then fell silent, clearly indicating the conversation was over. Elara turned to the window, watching as familiar landscapes gave way to increasingly wild and unfamiliar territory. The gentle hills of Thornvale's farmlands rose gradually into the foothills of the Blackspine Mountains. Ancient forests crowded the roadway, their canopies so dense that at times it seemed like twilight despite being midday. As the hours passed, Elara's thoughts turned increasingly dark. She touched the hidden dagger through her gown, wondering if she would have the courage to use it, either against the Vampire King or, if his cruelty proved unbearable, against herself. The weight of the blade was her only comfort as the world she knew receded behind her. By late afternoon, they began to climb in earnest. The road narrowed and wound around precarious bends, with steep drops on one side that plunged into mist-filled ravines. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Elara drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "We approach the borders of the king's domain," the emissary said, breaking its long silence. "Prepare yourself." As if responding to an unheard command, the mists parted before them, revealing a vista that stole Elara's breath. A vast valley stretched below, encircled by jagged mountain peaks that seemed to pierce the very sky. At its center, perched upon a towering spire of black rock, stood a castle of impossible architecture. Towers spiraled upward like frozen smoke, connected by bridges that appeared too delicate to support their own weight. The entire structure gleamed darkly in the fading light, as if carved from obsidian. "Ravenspire," the emissary announced, "home of the immortal court and seat of King Dravius's power for the past millennium." Elara could not tear her gaze from the castle. It was both terrifying and breathtaking, a monument to power beyond human understanding. This was to be her prison for whatever remained of her life. The road descended into the valley, winding through a forest of ancient trees whose trunks were wider than Thornvale's cottages. Elara noticed something strange as they traveled deeper into the wood. The forest was alive with light. Tiny, luminescent fungi clung to the trees, and flowers that should not bloom at this altitude glowed with an inner radiance. The effect was enchantingly beautiful, which somehow made it all the more sinister. "The Midnight Garden," the emissary explained, noting her fascination. "The king's ancestors enchanted these woods millennia ago. They bloom eternally, needing no sun. As darkness fully descended, they emerged from the forest onto a causeway that stretched across a black lake, leading directly to the castle gates. Mist clung to the water's surface, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of what might have been pale faces watching from below. The carriage halted before gates tall enough to admit giants, wrought from black iron and adorned with intricate scenes depicting battles long forgotten by human histories. With a sound like distant thunder, the gates swung open. "We have arrived," the emissary said, as the carriage rolled forward into a vast courtyard. "Welcome to your new home, bride of King Dravius." Servants materialized from the shadows as the carriage door opened, pale, beautiful beings with movements too fluid to be human. Their eyes, Elara noticed with a chill, were uniformly black, without whites or visible pupils. One stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Lady Elara," he said, his voice melodious yet cold, "I am Sylvan, chief steward of Ravenspire. We have prepared for your arrival. If you would follow me, I will escort you to your chambers, where you may refresh yourself before meeting His Majesty." Elara stepped from the carriage on legs that threatened to buckle beneath her. The castle loomed above, even more imposing up close. Gargoyles perched along its battlements, and she could have sworn one turned its head to watch her. "When am I to meet the king?" she asked, proud that her voice betrayed none of her terror. "After the midnight bell," Sylvan replied. "The king holds court when the moon is highest. Until then, you will be prepared." Prepared. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Ilara clutched her hidden dagger through the fabric of her gown and followed Sylvan into the castle that would either become her home or her tomb. The entrance hall stretched upward into darkness, its ceiling lost to shadows. Chandeliers of black crystal hung at various heights, filled with flames that burned blue instead of orange. Portraits lined the walls, faces of inhuman beauty watching her procession with painted eyes that somehow seemed to follow her movement. "The kings and queens of old," Sylvan explained, following her gaze. "Your husband's ancestors, who ruled these lands when humans still huddled in caves." Husband. The word sent a fresh wave of dread through Ilara. She was to be wed to a creature of nightmare, a being who had lived for centuries and would continue long after her bones had turned to dust. They ascended a spiral staircase that seemed to defy physics, its steps floating without visible support. Corridors branched in impossible directions, and Ilara quickly lost all sense of direction within the castle's labyrinthine interior. Finally, they arrived at a set of double doors carved with intricate patterns of ravens and roses. Sylvan pushed them open to reveal a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything Ilara had ever seen. "Your chambers, my lady," he said with another bow. "Handmaidens will attend you shortly to prepare you for your audience with the king. I suggest you rest until then." With that, he departed, leaving Ilara alone in the opulent prison. She explored the rooms slowly, trailing her fingers over furnishings of ebony wood and velvet upholstery. A four-poster bed dominated the bedchamber, draped with curtains of midnight blue embroidered with silver stars. A balcony beyond glass doors offered a view of the enchanted forest and the mountains beyond. On a mannequin near a dressing screen stood a gown unlike any Ilara had ever seen, a creation of shimmering fabric that seemed to shift between deep blue and purple, adorned with crystals that caught the light like trapped stars. A bride's gown for her presentation to the vampire king. As promised, handmaidens arrived, 3 women with the same pale beauty and black eyes as Sylvan. They spoke little as they helped Ilara bathe in a copper tub, filled with water scented with unfamiliar flowers. They dressed her in layers of silk undergarments, then the magnificent gown, which fit as if made specifically for her form. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, adorned with jeweled pins that glittered like constellations. When they finally led her to a mirror, Ilara hardly recognized herself. The woman who stared back appeared ethereal, otherworldly, a fitting bride for an immortal king. Only her eyes remained unchanged, green and bright, with barely contained fear. As the handmaidens made final adjustments to her appearance, the distant toll of a bell echoed through the castle. Midnight had arrived. Ilara felt her heart race, knowing what came next. "It is time," the eldest handmaiden announced. "His Majesty awaits." They led her through more winding corridors and down a grand staircase that opened onto a throne room vast enough to hold Thornvale's entire population. Courtiers lined the walls, beautiful, terrible creatures dressed in finery from countless eras. They watched her procession in silence, their black eyes betraying no emotion. At the far end, upon a dais of black marble, stood a throne that appeared to be carved from a single massive ruby, its facets catching and reflecting the blue flames that illuminated the chamber. And upon that throne, Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she beheld King Dravius for the first time. He was nothing like the monster of her imagination. The vampire king rose as she approached, revealing a tall figure of impossible grace. His features were sharply aristocratic, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and lips curved in what might have been amusement or cruelty. His hair, black as a moonless night, was tied back from his face with a simple band of silver. He wore formal attire of black and crimson, with a cape that seemed to move like liquid shadow around his shoulders. But it was his eyes that captured Ilara completely, neither black like his courtiers, nor red as village tales claimed, but a deep violet that held ancient wisdom and unfathomable secrets. As she reached the foot of the dais, Ilara sank into the deep curtsy she had been taught. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Rise," came his command, a voice like dark velvet, resonant with power, yet surprisingly gentle. Ilara obeyed, keeping her gaze lowered as protocol demanded. A moment of silence stretched between them, during which she felt the weight of his scrutiny. Then, to her shock, the Vampire King descended the steps until he stood directly before her. One cold finger slipped beneath her chin, tilting her face upward until she had no choice but to meet his gaze. Those violet eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel utterly exposed, as if he could see past flesh and bone to the very core of her being. "So," King Dravius said softly, his breath cool against her skin, "you are the bride Thornvale has sent to seal our ancient covenant." His head tilted slightly, considering her. "Tell me, Ilara Blackwood, do you know what happens to the brides who come to Ravenspire?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications too terrible to contemplate. Ilara's hand found the outline of the hidden dagger through her gown, drawing courage from its presence. "I've heard many tales, Your Majesty," she answered, amazed at the steadiness of her voice. "None of them hopeful." A smile curved the king's lips, revealing a glimpse of fangs. "And yet you came willingly." "I came to honor a covenant and protect my people," Ilara corrected him. "Willingness had little to do with it." A murmur rippled through the watching courtiers at her boldness. The king's smile widened fractionally. "Honesty," he said. "How refreshing." His finger traced a line from her chin to her collarbone, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. Most brides arrive weeping or paralyzed with fear. Some attempt flattery or seduction. None speak truth so plainly. Before Ilara could respond, King Dravius took her hand in his. His touch was cold but not unpleasant, like the first breath of winter against summer-warmed skin. "Come," he said, the word somewhere between invitation and command. "There is much you should know about your new home and the role you are to play here." As he led her away from the throne and the watching court, Ilara felt a curious sensation beneath her fear, a flicker of something unexpected. For in that brief moment when their hands joined, she had felt the Vampire King's touch tremble ever so slightly against her palm, belying the confidence in his violet gaze. And in that tremor lay the first seed of a realization that would soon shatter everything she believed about her fate. Perhaps the fearsome King Dravius was not entirely what legends claimed him to be. King Dravius led Ilara through a series of corridors that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves with each turn. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and coronations, celebrations and hunts, a visual history of the vampire realm that spanned millennia. "You're wondering about the previous brides," Dravius said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. His voice carried no echo despite the cavernous halls. Ilara looked up at him, studying his profile, the sharp angle of his jaw, the subtle hollow beneath his cheekbone. "Yes," she admitted. "Village rumors suggest none survived long." A shadow passed across his face. Humans and their tales, always embellishing, always assuming the worst. He guided her through a doorway that opened onto a moonlit garden. Impossible, given that they had climbed several flights of stairs and should have been high within a tower. The garden was unlike anything Ilara had ever seen. Flowers of species unknown to her bloomed in profusion, many glowing with an inner light that illuminated pathways of polished black stone. Fountains of what appeared to be liquid silver bubbled softly, while nightingales sang from trees whose leaves shimmered like beaten metal. "This is the Queen's garden," Dravius explained, watching her reaction carefully. "Created for the first vampire queen over 3,000 years ago, and maintained since by each who followed." Ilara touched a blossom that pulsed with gentle blue light. It curled around her finger affectionately, like a living thing seeking warmth. "Each queen has added something to this place," Dravius continued, indicating different sections of the garden. "Mirlith brought the singing trees from the Eastern Isles. Lysandra created the pools that reflect not the sky but the dreamer's deepest wishes. Ilara turned to face him, understanding dawning. Queens, not brides. You're saying the women from Thornvale became queens, he finished. Rulers of the vampire realm alongside me, not sacrifices. She studied him skeptically. Then where are they now, if they weren't killed? Walk with me. Dravius offered his arm, which she hesitantly took. He guided her deeper into the garden, toward a circular clearing surrounded by 12 statues of women, each carved from different stone and depicted in various poses. Some held books, others weapons. One cradled what appeared to be a child. The Covenant Queens, Dravius said softly. Your predecessors from Thornvale. Ilara approached the nearest statue, a woman with a determined expression, carved from rose quartz. What happened to them? They lived out their lives, Dravius answered simply. They ruled alongside me, each bringing different gifts to our realm. Some lived for decades, others for centuries. Centuries! Ilara turned to him in disbelief. But they were human, like me. A strange expression crossed Dravius's face. The transformation was always their choice. Some chose to remain human, accepting the natural course of aging and death. Others chose to become vampire, extending their lives indefinitely. And these women, they were truly queens, not prisoners, not, she couldn't bring herself to say, meals. Dravius's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Not what your village elders led you to believe? No? The covenant between Thornvale and my realm has never been about sacrifice in the way humans imagine. He gestured to the statue in the center of the circle. A woman carved from obsidian, her expression serene yet powerful. Eliana was the first. She negotiated the covenant when Thornvale was nothing more than a collection of huts threatened by werewolf packs and disease. Our histories say differently, Ilara said cautiously. I'm sure they do. Easier to believe your ancestors traded a maiden for protection than to accept that they needed an ambassador in the immortal court, someone who could speak for human interests. He paused before the obsidian statue. Eliana was a diplomat, not a victim. She proposed the covenant herself. Ilara struggled to reconcile this information with everything she had been raised to believe. If what you say is true, why perpetuate the fear? Why allow Thornvale to believe its daughters are being sacrificed? Dravius's expression darkened. Fear ensures compliance. Tales of vampiric brutality keep curious humans from wandering into our territories. The elders of your village understand the true nature of our arrangement, but find it more effective to rule through superstition than truth. So I'm to be an ambassador, not a bride. Hope flickered in Ilara's chest. Both, Dravius corrected. The marriage is real, a binding of our realms, but your role is to represent human interests in my court, and to learn our ways. Ilara absorbed this, her mind reeling with implications. And if I refuse? You won't be forced, Dravius said with surprising gentleness, but the covenant would be broken. Without our protection, Thornvale would be vulnerable again to the threats that necessitated our agreement in the first place. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Ilara's shoulders. You could have explained this before bringing me here. Would you have believed me? Dravius challenged. Or would you have assumed my words were tricks to lure you willingly? Ilara had no answer, recognizing the truth in his assessment. She would have indeed suspected deception. Still, a lifetime of ingrained fear did not disappear in a single conversation, no matter how revelatory. Come, Dravius said, noting her thoughtful silence. There is someone you should meet. They left the garden through a different door than they had entered, emerging into a warm, well-lit chamber that looked surprisingly human. Bookshelves lined the walls, comfortable chairs clustered near a hearth where actual fire, not the blue flames elsewhere in the castle, burned cheerfully. The room smelled of parchment, tea, and beeswax. Seated in one of the chairs was an elderly woman with silver hair arranged in an elegant knot. She wore a gown of deep green velvet, and around her neck hung a pendant similar to the one Elder Matthias wore in Thornvale. When she looked up from her book, her eyes, unlike the black-eyed servant's or Dravius's violet gaze, were a warm brown. "Ilara Blackwood," Dravius announced, "may I present Helena Thornfield, 12th Covenant Bride and Queen Emeritus of the Vampire Realm." The woman set aside her book and rose with surprising grace for one so advanced in years. "At last," she said, her voice carrying the same accent as Ilara's own village. "I've been quite eager to meet you, my dear." Ilara stared in disbelief. "You're from Thornvale?" "Born and raised," Helena confirmed with a smile. "Though it's been 70 years since I last walked its streets. I was sent here just as you were, believing I was to be some monster's meal. But you're—" Ilara struggled to find words. "Human?" Helena finished for her. "Yes, I chose to remain so. Some of us do." She extended a wrinkled hand to Ilara. "Come, sit with me. Dravius, be a dear and leave us women to talk." To Ilara's astonishment, the Vampire King bowed slightly to the elderly woman. "As you wish, Helena. I'll return in an hour to escort Ilara to her chambers." Once he had left, closing the door behind him, Helena poured tea from a silver pot into delicate cups. "You have questions," she said, handing one to Ilara. "I imagine they're similar to the ones I had 7 decades ago." "You weren't sacrificed," Ilara said, still processing this revelation. Helena chuckled. "My dear, do I look sacrificed to you? I've lived a fuller life in this castle than I ever could have in Thornvale. I've advised kings, prevented wars, saved countless lives, both human and vampire. But you never returned home." A shadow crossed Helena's face. "That is the one truth of the Covenant that remains painful. Once we cross the threshold of Ravenspire, we cannot return to Thornvale. The magic that protects your village would be compromised if we did." "So it is a prison," Ilara said softly. "A gilded one, perhaps," Helena conceded, "but not in the way you fear. The world beyond Thornvale is vast and wonderful, Ilara. As Covenant Queens, we cannot return to that one village, but we can travel anywhere else. I've seen the crystal cities of the Southern Empire, sailed the Midnight Sea, even visited the floating libraries of Ethereum." Ilara sipped her tea, finding comfort in its familiar taste. "And the king, Dravius, what manner of husband is he?" Helena's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. "That depends entirely on the queen. Dravius has lived for millennia. He's seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the best and worst of both humans and vampires. He can be cold, certainly, ruthless when necessary, but cruel, no. The stories say he bathes in virgin blood and decorates with human bones," Helena interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Propaganda, my dear. Useful propaganda that keeps foolish humans from wandering into vampire territory, looking for immortality or riches." Ilara's fingers found the outline of the dagger hidden in her gown. "My mother gave me this before I left," she said, drawing it partially from its hiding place. "For protection." Helena studied the weapon with knowing eyes. "My father did the same. I kept it for 20 years, before finally gifting it to the royal armory. By then, I understood I had never needed it." "Did you love him?" Ilara asked suddenly. "Dravius?" The old woman's smile turned thoughtful. "Love is a complicated thing when your husband is immortal while you remain human. We were partners, friends, occasionally lovers when it suited us both. But romantic love, that belongs to stories more than reality, when the participants are so fundamentally different. And he accepted this arrangement. Dravius has had many great loves throughout his long existence," Helena explained. "Some vampire, some human. The Covenant does not demand your heart, Ilara, only your presence and your willingness to serve as bridge between our worlds." Ilara considered this, feeling both relieved and oddly disappointed. "The ceremony's tomorrow, the wedding." "Political necessity," Helena confirmed. "Though I should warn you, vampire weddings are considerably more intense than human ones. Before Ilara could ask what she meant, a knock at the door announced Dravius's return. "Dawn approaches," he said as he entered. "Helena requires rest, as do you, Ilara. The ceremonies will begin at sunset." Helena squeezed Ilara's hand. "We'll speak again, my dear. And remember, whatever you decide, the choice is truly yours." As Dravius escorted her back through the labyrinthine corridors, Ilara's mind whirled with everything she had learned. If Helena spoke truth, and Ilara sensed she did, then her fate was far different than she had feared. Yet questions remained, and suspicions lingered. "Why did no one tell me the truth before I left Thornvale?" she asked as they approached her chambers. Dravius considered before answering. "Your elders believe fear is a stronger motivator than truth. They worry that without the threat of sacrifice, your village might forget the importance of the covenant. And perhaps they're right." He paused at her door. "Would you have come willingly, if told you were to be an ambassador rather than a sacrifice?" Ilara hesitated, realizing she wasn't certain. "Precisely." Dravius opened her door. "Rest now. Tomorrow will test you in ways you cannot anticipate." As he turned to leave, Ilara found herself calling after him. The transformation Helena mentioned, becoming a vampire. "Is it painful?" Dravius stopped, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "Excruciatingly so," he answered honestly, "which is why it is never forced upon a covenant queen. Sleep well, Ilara Blackwood. Tomorrow you become my wife in name, if not in heart." With that, he was gone, leaving Ilara alone with her thoughts and the faint light of approaching dawn filtering through her windows. She approached the balcony, gazing out at the enchanted forest and the mountains beyond. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay Thornvale and the life she had known. She touched the hidden dagger, wondering if she would ever need to use it, or if it would remain a symbol of fears unfounded. If Helena spoke truth, then Ilara faced not death, but a different life entirely, one of potential power and purpose beyond anything available to her in Thornvale. Yet doubts persisted. Why would vampire kind need human queens, if not for some darker purpose? And why did the previous brides never return, not even to visit? The pieces didn't quite align, suggesting truths yet unrevealed. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of violet eyes and ancient secrets waiting to be discovered. Ilara awoke to the sound of her chamber doors opening. 3 handmaidens, different from those who had attended her the previous night, entered bearing trays of food, fresh clothing, and various mysterious items. "Good evening, my lady," the eldest said, her black eyes unreadable. "We come to prepare you for the binding ceremony." Ilara sat up, momentarily disoriented. "Evening? How long have I slept?" "Through the daylight hours, as is custom in Ravenspire," the handmaiden answered, placing a tray of unfamiliar fruits and bread beside Ilara's bed. "Eat. You will need strength for what comes." The preparations that followed were elaborate and occasionally unsettling. After bathing in water infused with herbs that made her skin tingle uncomfortably, Ilara was dressed in layers of gossamer fabric that shifted between midnight blue and deep crimson depending on how the light struck it. Her hair was arranged with dozens of tiny crystals that caught the light like trapped stars, and around her throat they placed a delicate silver collar from which hung a single teardrop ruby. "Blood diamond," one handmaiden explained when she caught Ilara examining it. "Formed from the first vampire king's tears when his human love perished. It symbolizes the eternal bond between your kind and ours." "That's romantic, I suppose," Ilara murmured, unsure whether to be touched or disturbed. "Not romantic," the handmaiden corrected. "Sacred. The stone ensures that no vampire in the realm can harm you while you wear it. It is both protection and symbol of your authority." As the sun fully set beyond her windows, the handmaidens completed their work. Standing before a mirror, Ilara barely recognized herself. The woman who gazed back appeared ethereal, otherworldly, neither fully human nor vampire, but something in between. "It is time," announced a male voice from the doorway. Sylvan, the chief steward, had returned. The court assembles. King Dravius awaits. The journey through the castle this time seemed deliberately designed to impress. They descended staircases that spiraled impossibly through open air, crossed bridges spanning caverns lit by thousands of floating lights, and passed through galleries where vampire nobles bowed respectfully as Ilara processed. Finally, they arrived at massive doors, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of bone, inlaid with silver runes that pulsed with gentle light. "The Great Hall of Binding," Sylvan announced. "Built at the founding of our realm, it has witnessed every significant covenant in vampire history." He studied Ilara with his unsettling black eyes. "Remember, once you cross this threshold as a bride, you may never return to Thornvale. This is your final opportunity to refuse." Ilara thought of Helena, of the life she described, neither perfect nor horrific, but complex and potentially meaningful. She thought of Thornvale and the limited future that awaited her there. She touched the hidden dagger, still secure in a pocket sewn into her gown, a reminder that she retained some measure of choice, regardless of what lay ahead. "I will proceed," she said firmly. Sylvan nodded once, then raised his hands. The great doors swung open silently, revealing a vast, circular chamber packed with hundreds of observers. Vampire nobles in their finery lined tiered seating that rose several stories upward, while in the center of the room stood a raised dais upon which Dravius waited. The vampire king wore ceremonial armor of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His hair was loose around his shoulders, and atop his head rested a crown of twisted silver set with violet stones that matched his eyes. As Ilara stepped into the chamber, a hush fell over the assembly. Music began. Strange, haunting melodies played on instruments she couldn't identify. Her feet carried her forward as if by their own volition, drawn to the magnetic presence of the king, who watched her approach with an intensity that made her heart race. When she reached the dais, Dravius extended his hand. "Ilara of Thornvale," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast space. "Do you come freely to bind yourself to the covenant?" "I come freely," she answered, surprised at the steadiness in her voice. "Do you understand that in accepting the mantle of Covenant Queen, you forsake your former home forever?" A pang of grief shot through her at these words, making the reality of her choice suddenly, painfully clear. "I understand," she said, the words barely audible. "And do you pledge to serve as bridge between human and vampire kind, to represent the interests of both, to maintain the balance that has preserved peace for centuries?" This question was unexpected. Nothing in Thornvale's preparations had mentioned such responsibility, yet it aligned with what Helena had told her about the true purpose of Covenant Queens. "I pledge myself to this duty," Ilara answered, finding truth in the words as she spoke them. Dravius's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then come," he said, guiding her to stand beside him on the dais. An elderly vampire approached, carrying a silver chalice filled with dark liquid that Ilara desperately hoped was wine. The scent that reached her nostrils, however, was unmistakably metallic. "The binding requires blood," Dravius explained quietly, noting her alarm. "Mine, mixed with sacred wine. You need drink only a sip to seal the covenant." The elderly vampire offered the chalice first to Dravius, who took it and raised it high for all to see. "With this blood, I bind the covenant anew," he proclaimed. "Let all who witness remember the sacred pact between vampire and humankind." He drank deeply, then offered the chalice to Ilara. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. The liquid inside was dark red, tinged with particles that caught the light like tiny diamonds. "Drink," Dravius urged softly. "Just a taste." Steeling herself, Ilara raised the chalice to her lips and took the smallest possible sip. The liquid burned like fire going down her throat, spreading warmth through her body with alarming speed. Her vision blurred momentarily, and she might have stumbled if Dravius hadn't steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "The worst is past," he whispered, as the elderly vampire reclaimed the chalice. "Now comes the seal." Before Ilara could ask what he meant, Dravius turned to face her directly. His violet eyes seemed to glow with inner light as he placed his hands on either side of her face. The touch was cool, but not unpleasant, like the first breath of autumn after summer's heat. "With this kiss, the covenant is sealed," he said, his voice resonating with power that seemed to vibrate through Ilara's very bones. As his lips met hers, something extraordinary happened. The blood she had consumed seemed to ignite within her veins, creating connections between them that manifested as visible strands of light. She could feel Dravius's presence in her mind, not invasive, but undeniably there, like knowing someone stands behind you without having to look. When he finally drew back, Ilara gasped for breath, overwhelmed by sensations she couldn't begin to describe. The assembled vampires erupted in sounds of celebration, not cheers or applause as humans might offer, but a harmonic humming that built into a physical force resonating throughout the chamber. "It is done," Dravius said, his voice somehow audible despite the noise. "You are now Covenant Queen, with all the privileges and responsibilities thereof." Ilara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a tremendous crash echoed through the hall as the great bone doors burst open. Sylvan rushed in, his normally composed features contorted with alarm. "Your Majesty," he called out, "we are under attack." Dravius's expression hardened instantly. "Who dares?" "Werewolves, sire," Sylvan reported grimly. "A massive pack, led by Fenris the Dread. They've breached the outer defenses." Murmurs of alarm spread through the assembly. Ilara caught fragments of conversation. "Impossible, and the wards should have prevented, and betrayal. How could they penetrate our barriers?" Dravius demanded, already moving toward the exit, pulling Ilara along with him. "Unknown, sire. But they carry Thornvale steel." Dravius froze, his grip on Ilara's arm tightening painfully. Slowly, he turned to face her, his violet eyes now blazing with fury. "Thornvale steel," he repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "Weapons forged specifically to kill vampires, using secrets our kind shared with your village as part of the Covenant." "I know nothing of this," Ilara protested, genuine confusion and fear coursing through her. "Perhaps not," Dravius conceded, though his expression remained suspicious. "But the timing is convenient. The night of a new Covenant binding, when our defenses are traditionally focused inward for the ceremony rather than outward against threats." Before Ilara could defend herself further, another crash resonated through the castle, this one closer. The sound of fighting could now be heard, snarls and screams echoing down corridors. "Take her to the sanctuary," Dravius ordered Sylvan. "Guard her with your life. If this is treachery, I will discover it. If it is coincidence, she must be protected at all costs." He turned back to Ilara, his expression unreadable. "The binding is fresh. If you attempt to flee or betray us, I will feel it through our connection. Remember that." With those ominous words, he strode from the hall, summoning guards with a gesture. Within moments, the celebration had transformed into military preparation, with vampire nobles retrieving weapons hidden within their formal attire. "This way, Your Majesty," Sylvan urged, using her new title for the first time, as he guided her toward a concealed door behind the dais. As they hurried through secret passages, Ilara's mind raced. Werewolves attacking with Thornvale steel? It made no sense. The village had always feared werewolves. They were the primary threat the vampire covenant protected against. Why would Thornvale arm them? Unless everything she had been told, by the elders, by Helena, by Dravius himself, was only partial truth. "Sylvan," she said as they descended a narrow spiral staircase, "what exactly is Thornvale steel?" The steward glanced back at her with surprise. "You truly don't know? It's metal infused with the blood of Thornvale villagers, a specific bloodline with properties deadly to our kind. The forging process is known only to your village elders. It was part of the original covenant, shared defense. Your people would craft weapons that could kill werewolves and vampires alike, but swore to use them only against our mutual enemies. The implications hit Ilara like a physical blow. Her village had not been helpless victims needing vampire protection. They had possessed the means to defend themselves, and possibly to destroy their supposed protectors, which meant the covenant was not what either side had claimed. And as howls echoed through the castle walls, drawing ever closer, Ilara realized she had bound herself to a pact whose true nature remained dangerously unknown. Sylvan led Ilara deeper into the castle's hidden passages, the distant sounds of battle growing fainter. The narrow corridor spiraled downward, illuminated by glowing stones embedded in the walls that pulsed like heartbeats. With each step, questions multiplied in Ilara's mind, suspicion blossoming like a poisonous flower. "This sanctuary," she asked, slightly breathless from their pace, "what exactly is it?" "A chamber created for the protection of Covenant queens," Sylvan replied without slowing. "Warded against all threats, accessible only to those with royal blood or those specifically granted entry." "Like you." Sylvan's lips tightened. "I serve the royal family. My loyalty grants me certain privileges." They reached the bottom of the staircase and faced a blank wall of polished obsidian. Sylvan placed his palm against its surface, which rippled like disturbed water before melting away to reveal a small antechamber. "Quickly," he urged. Inside, the antechamber opened into a surprisingly comfortable space. A circular room with plush furnishings, well-stocked bookshelves, and provisions that suggested it was designed for extended stays. At its center stood a pedestal supporting a crystal sphere that displayed real-time images of various castle locations, currently showing scenes of chaotic fighting. Ilara approached the sphere, watching with horror as werewolves, massive creatures with wickedly intelligent eyes, tore through vampire defenders. The creatures wielded weapons that gleamed with unnatural light, and whenever these blades connected with vampire flesh, the wounds smoked and refused to heal. "Thornvale steel," Sylvan confirmed, noting her focus, "the only substance that can deliver a true death to our kind." Ilara turned to him, eyes narrowed. "You keep saying I should know these things, yet nothing in my upbringing prepared me for this knowledge. Why would the elders keep such secrets, even from the chosen bride?" Sylvan's expression grew guarded. "That is not for me to speculate upon, Your Majesty." "Then tell me what you know with certainty," Ilara pressed. "The true nature of this covenant, not what I've been told by either side, but what you have witnessed in your service." The steward hesitated, his eternal loyalty visibly warring with something else, perhaps compassion for her situation. Finally, he sighed. "The covenant is complex. More complex than either King Dravius or Queen Helena revealed to you." He gestured to a nearby seating area. "Perhaps you should sit." Ilara remained standing. "I prefer to face difficult truths on my feet." A ghost of a smile touched Sylvan's lips. "As you wish. The covenant between Thornvale and our realm was indeed initiated to protect your village from werewolf threats. This much is true. But there was another purpose, one that serves our kind more directly. The queens," Ilara guessed. "It's not just about having an ambassador, is it?" "No." Sylvan's black eyes held something like regret. "The bloodline of Thornvale's founding families possesses unique properties that strengthen our realm in ways ordinary human blood cannot." Ilara's hand instinctively went to the ruby pendant at her throat. The blood diamond, as the handmaiden had called it. "The binding ceremony," she said, realization dawning. "It wasn't just symbolic." "The binding creates a channel," Sylvan confirmed. "A means by which the Queen's essence gradually reinforces the magical barriers protecting our realm. This is why Covenant queens who choose to remain human age more slowly than ordinary mortals, their life force is partially diverted to sustaining Ravenspire's defenses." Ilara felt suddenly lightheaded. "So I am being sacrificed after all. Just slowly." I would not characterize it as sacrifice, Sylvan objected. The process harms neither your health nor your natural lifespan. In fact, it extends it, but it does create a connection that cannot be severed except by death. A sudden crash from the viewing sphere drew their attention. A group of werewolves had breached the throne room, their massive forms destroying priceless artifacts in their rampage. At their center stood a figure larger than the rest, a creature with silver-streaked black fur and eyes that burned like molten gold. Fenris, Sylvan whispered, the name carrying palpable dread. Ilara watched as the werewolf leader sniffed the air, then looked directly at the viewing sphere, as if he could see through it to where she stood. A chill ran down her spine as the creature's muzzle pulled back in what could only be described as a smile. He's hunting something specific, she said, not just attacking randomly. Sylvan paled. Or someone specific. The realization struck simultaneously. Me, Ilara breathed. But why? Thornvale has no alliance with werewolves. They've been our enemies for generations. Before Sylvan could respond, the door to the sanctuary shimmered as something massive struck it from outside. The obsidian surface, which had seemed impenetrable, developed a spiderweb of cracks. Impossible, Sylvan hissed, backing away. These barriers have stood for millennia. Another blow landed, widening the cracks. Through them, Ilara glimpsed a massive clawed hand, and dangling from it a familiar silver pendant. That's Elder Matthias's symbol of office, she gasped. How could a werewolf possess it? A third blow shattered the doorway completely. Dust and fragments of obsidian rained down as Fenris himself stooped to enter the chamber. Up close, he was even more terrifying, easily 8 feet tall, with muscles rippling beneath his matted fur. The pendant hung from one claw, and in his other paw he clutched a sword of gleaming metal that Ilara recognized immediately. "That's my father's blade," she whispered, shock rendering her momentarily immobile. It disappeared after his death. Sylvan moved to stand between her and the werewolf, but with a casual swipe of his arm, Fenris sent the steward flying across the room, where he struck the wall with a sickening crack and crumpled to the floor. Ilara's hand found the hidden dagger in her gown, drawing it out as she backed away. The small blade seemed pathetically inadequate against the monster before her, but it was her only defense. To her shock, Fenris made no move to attack. Instead, he dropped to one knee, lowering his massive head in what appeared to be deference. "Queen Ilara," the creature growled, his voice a rumbling bass that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "At last we meet." Ilara kept the dagger raised. "You know my name?" "I know everything about you," Fenris replied. "Daughter of William Blackwood, the finest swordsman Thornvale ever produced." He raised the sword he carried. "A man I had the honor of fighting alongside, not against, despite what your elders would have you believe." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ilara's feet. "You lie. My father fought to protect Thornvale from your kind. Your father fought to protect Thornvale from all threats, including the lies perpetuated by your elders." Fenris rose slowly, careful to make no threatening moves. He discovered the truth about the covenant and sought to break it. For this, he was killed, not by werewolves, but by those who benefit from keeping Thornvale isolated and ignorant. Ilara's mind raced, trying to reconcile this claim with everything she believed about her father's death. "Prove it," she demanded, her voice barely steady. Fenris extended the sword, hilt first. "This blade bears your father's mark, but also mine. We were blood brothers, bound by oath to expose the truth of the covenant." Hesitantly, Ilara took the weapon. It felt strangely right in her hand, as if made for her grip. On the hilt, just as Fenris claimed, were 2 marks intertwined, her father's sigil and what she now recognized as the werewolf alpha's personal mark. "This proves nothing," she said, though doubt had begun to erode her certainty. "You could have added this mark after taking the sword from his body. Ask yourself why the elders never returned this blade to your family," Fenris countered. Why they claimed his body was too ravaged to be viewed, why they discouraged all questions about the circumstances of his death. A commotion from the viewing sphere interrupted them. King Dravius had entered the throne room, surrounded by his royal guard. Vampires and werewolves clashed violently, but the king fought with a fury that seemed to clear a path directly toward the sanctuary. "We have little time," Fenris growled urgently. "You drank from the binding chalice, yes? The connection is established, but not yet fully formed. There is still a chance to break it before it becomes permanent." "Why should I trust you?" Ilara demanded. "You've slaughtered dozens of vampires to reach me." "Only those who stood in our path," Fenris corrected, "and only with weapons that allow a clean death rather than eternal suffering. We are not monsters, despite what you've been taught." A groan from across the room signaled Sylvan regaining consciousness. The steward struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a wound on his temple. "Don't listen to him, Your Majesty," Sylvan warned. "Werewolves are masters of manipulation. They seek to disrupt the Covenant for their own gain." "And what exactly would that gain be?" Ilara challenged, her confidence growing as she held her father's sword. "If what you've told me is true, the Covenant drains my life force to power your defenses. Why would werewolves object to vampires being protected?" Sylvan hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Because the defenses don't just keep threats out," Fenris answered for him. "They keep secrets in. The Covenant creates a barrier around Thornvale as well, one that prevents certain knowledge from spreading, certain questions from being asked." He gestured to Ilara's sword. "Your father discovered this when he attempted to investigate unexplained disappearances from the village. Not just Covenant brides, but others, children mostly." "Children?" Ilara whispered, horror creeping through her veins. "Enough," Sylvan snarled, his composed demeanor shattering as his face contorted into something far less human. Fangs extended from his upper jaw, and his eyes glowed with inner fire. "The king comes. He will deal with this intrusion." As if summoned by his words, the shattered doorway filled with a swirling darkness that coalesced into Dravius's form. The vampire king entered the sanctuary, his armor splattered with blood, his violet eyes burning with rage. "Fenris," he hissed, the name like venom on his tongue. "You dare violate the sacred grounds of my castle. The punishment for this transgression is eternal torment." The werewolf alpha straightened to his full height, unintimidated. "I dare much more than that, vampire. I dare to speak truth to your new queen, truth you and the Thornvale elders have conspired to conceal for centuries." Dravius's gaze shifted to Ilara, noting the sword in her hand and the dagger still clutched in the other. Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. "So it comes to this," he said softly. "I had hoped for more time before this confrontation became necessary." He extended a hand toward her. "Ilara, whatever lies this beast has told you, know that the Covenant exists to protect both our realms. Come to my side, and I will explain everything once this threat is eliminated." Ilara stood frozen between them, the weight of decision pressing down upon her. Through the nascent bond formed by the ceremony, she could feel Dravius's emotions, genuine concern, yes, but also calculation, a ruthless assessment of how much control he still maintained over her. "Tell me about the children," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The ones who disappeared from Thornvale." Dravius's expression hardened. "Village superstitions. There have been no—" "Do not lie to her," Fenris growled. "Not when she can feel your deception through the bond." And indeed, Ilara felt it, a cold, slithering sensation through the connection, the unmistakable texture of falsehood. "The Covenant requires more than one bride per century," she guessed, pieces falling into place. "It needs regular reinforcement." "The children were necessary," Dravius admitted, his tone suggesting irritation at being forced to explain. "A small price for the protection of an entire village. Their lives were not wasted. They were transformed, elevated to serve a greater purpose." "Transformed how?" Ilara pressed, though dread pooled in her stomach. "The servants," Sylvan interjected, his voice hollow. "The handmaidens, the guards with black eyes. All were once human children from Thornvale, their essence used to strengthen the barriers, their bodies repurposed to serve." Horror washed over Ilara as she recalled the handmaidens who had prepared her, their emotionless black eyes, their unnatural grace. Had they once been ordinary village children, stolen from their families and converted into these empty vessels? "You speak of them as if they were nothing more than resources," she accused Dravius, disgust overriding her fear. "They are given immortality, perfect health, freedom from human suffering," Dravius countered. "In return, they serve. It is a fair exchange. An exchange they never consented to." Ilara's voice rose with her anger. "Children taken from their homes, their humanity stripped away. And for what? So vampires can live in luxury behind magical walls? So both our peoples can survive," Dravius shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Do you think vampire kind would endure without these measures? Do you think Thornvale would stand for a single generation without our protection? The world beyond is far more dangerous than you can imagine." "And what of my role in this bargain?" Ilara demanded. "Was I to be slowly drained until nothing remained but another black-eyed servant?" "No," Dravius insisted, stepping closer. "Covenant queens are different, sacred. You would have lived for centuries, aged only slightly. You would have had power, influence, as long as I never questioned the disappearance of children from my village," Ilara finished bitterly. "As long as I accepted my comfortable prison." Fenris growled his approval. "Now you understand why your father sought to break the covenant, why he died for that knowledge." Dravius's face twisted with fury. "William Blackwood was a fool who would have condemned both our peoples to destruction. Yes, I ordered his death, and I would do so again to preserve what our ancestors built." The confession struck Ilara like a physical blow. She stumbled back, the sword in her hand suddenly leaden with the weight of revelation. "You murdered my father," she whispered. "I preserved the covenant," Dravius corrected, "as I must now do again." He turned to Sylvan. "The binding is incomplete. Prepare the secondary ritual." Sylvan nodded grimly and moved toward a concealed panel in the wall. "No!" Fenris roared, lunging toward the steward. But Dravius intercepted him, moving with supernatural speed. The two collided in a blur of motion, werewolf strength meeting vampire speed in a deadly dance. Claws slashed, fangs snapped, and the air itself seemed to shudder with the force of their hatred. Ilara didn't wait to see the outcome. With Sylvan's attention diverted by the fight, she raced to the panel he had been approaching, using the hilt of her father's sword to smash the mechanism before he could activate it. "You don't understand what you're doing," Sylvan hissed, grabbing her arm. "Without the completed binding, the barriers will begin to fail. All of Ravenspire and Thornvale, too, will be vulnerable." "Better vulnerable than built on the suffering of innocents," Ilara retorted, wrenching free of his grasp. Across the room, Dravius had pinned Fenris against a wall, his hand around the werewolf's throat. "Your interference ends here, dog," the vampire king snarled. "I will mount your head above my throne as a reminder to all who would challenge the covenant." Ilara felt something pulse within her, the nascent bond created by the binding ceremony, still fragile but growing stronger with each passing minute. Through it, she sensed Dravius's triumph, his absolute certainty in his righteousness, but beneath that, something unexpected. Fear, not just of the Covenant's failure, but of something deeper, older, something that lurked beyond the barriers he so desperately sought to maintain. In that moment of clarity, Ilara understood her power. The binding worked both ways. Just as it allowed her essence to strengthen Ravenspire's defenses, it created a channel through which she could potentially affect the very magic that sustained them. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. "Strength and wisdom run in your blood. The blood that made Thornvale steel so deadly to vampires. The blood that powered the Covenant itself." With sudden resolve, Ilara raised her father's sword, and before Sylvan could stop her, drew the blade across her palm. Blood, her covenant-bound blood, welled from the wound, dripping onto the sanctuary floor. "By my blood, freely given," she declared, words coming to her as if from ancestral memory, "I challenge the terms of this covenant." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and throughout the viewing sphere she saw similar tremors shaking the castle. The blood droplets on the floor didn't pool. Instead, they sank into the stone, which began to glow with increasing intensity. Drevius released Fenris and spun toward her, horror etched across his perfect features. "What have you done?" he breathed. "What my father would have done," Ilara answered, feeling power surging through her veins, a heady mixture of terror and exhilaration. "I'm breaking the covenant and setting new terms." The sanctuary walls began to crack, light pouring through the fissures. The viewing sphere shattered, and the castle images it had displayed now projected directly into the air around them. Scenes of chaos as vampires fled crumbling corridors, as werewolves stopped fighting to stare in awe at the unraveling magic. "You can't," Dravius said, desperation replacing anger. He reached for her, only to be repelled by an invisible barrier formed by her blood. "Ilara, listen to me. What lies beyond the Covenant's protection is worse than anything you can imagine. There are ancient evils that—" A tremendous crack interrupted him as the ceiling began to split open, revealing not the castle above, but a star-filled sky that should have been impossible. As if the sanctuary existed in some space between dimensions. And among those stars, something moved. Something vast and dark, with eyes like dying suns. "It's too late," Drevius whispered, all pretense of control abandoned. "They've found us." Fenris limped to Ilara's side, his golden eyes fixed on the thing in the sky. "The true enemy," he growled. "The one both vampires and werewolves joined forces to fight a millennium ago, before the Covenant corrupted into what it became." The entity above seemed to notice their attention, its massive form shifting toward them with terrible purpose. "What is it?" Ilara asked, her voice small against the cosmic horror unfolding above. "The Void Walkers," Dravius answered suddenly at her other side. "Devourers of worlds. The Covenant was originally created to hide our realms from their hunger. But the price became too high," Fenris added. "The protection became its own form of prison." As the creature descended toward them, Ilara felt the weight of choice pressing upon her once more. The Covenant, corrupt as it had become, had indeed protected against something far worse. But its foundations were built on suffering and lies. "There must be another way," she said, raising her bleeding palm toward the starry void. "A covenant freely chosen, not forced upon the unwilling." Power surged through her, her bloodline's power amplified by the incomplete binding ceremony. In that moment, suspended between terrible choices, Ilara Blackwood made her own path. "By my blood, I offer a new covenant," she declared, her voice carrying impossible distances. "One of true partnership between realms, of protection earned through sacrifice freely given, not taken by force." The blood from her wound rose upward in a spiraling column, reaching toward the descending horror. Where they met, reality itself seemed to bend and warp. Dravius and Fenris, ancient enemies, stood transfixed on either side of her, watching as the Covenant Queen rewrote the terms of their existence, uncertain whether her gambit would save them all or condemn their worlds to oblivion. The blood that rose from Ilara's wound met the descending darkness, creating a brilliant explosion of crimson light that forced everyone to shield their eyes. When the blinding flash subsided, the Void Walker had paused its descent, suspended in the tear between realms, like an immense shadow with countless shifting forms. The entity seemed to be considering. "Impossible," Dravius whispered, his voice barely audible. "They've never negotiated before." "Because no one ever offered them a choice," Ilara replied, a strange calm settling over her despite the cosmic horror hovering above. Her blood continued to spiral upward, forming an ethereal bridge between her and the ancient entity. Through this connection, impressions flooded her mind, alien thoughts and emotions from the Void Walker. Not malice, she realized with shock, but hunger. Not cruelty, but necessity. These beings didn't devour worlds out of hatred, but out of a primal need, as intrinsic to their nature as breathing was to humans. "I understand now," she said, her voice resonating with newfound power. "They hunt what radiates strongest, and for centuries the corrupt covenant has been a beacon drawing them to us, the concentration of stolen life force like a flame to these moths." Fenris growled, his golden eyes fixed on the entity above. "So the vampire's protection ultimately made us more vulnerable." "Not intentionally," Ilara corrected, insights continuing to flow through the blood connection. "The original covenant was pure, a shared sacrifice for mutual protection. But over generations, as fear replaced cooperation, the magic twisted into something parasitic." Dravius's face registered shock, then a flicker of shame. "The first Covenant Queen, Eliana, she volunteered. All the records confirm it. But those who followed," Ilara challenged, "the children?" The Vampire King could not meet her gaze. The sanctuary continued to crumble around them, reality itself becoming unstable as the ancient magic unraveled. Through the viewing images still hovering in the air, Ilara could see the castle's inhabitants, vampire and werewolf alike, pausing in their battle to stare upward, as similar tears appeared in the sky above Ravenspire. "We have moments, not minutes," Fenris warned, his massive form tensing as debris began falling from the ceiling. Ilara closed her eyes, focusing on the connection her blood had created. She could feel the Void Walker's hunger, but also its curiosity, an entity so ancient that a new experience was precious beyond measure. "I offer you a covenant of balance," she addressed the entity, both aloud and through the blood link. "Not the stolen life force of unwilling sacrifices, but energy freely given in measured amounts that harm none. A sustainable harvest rather than devastation." Images formed in her mind, complex patterns of exchange where the Void Walkers would receive regular, smaller offerings of energy instead of being tempted to devour entire realms, where they would pass over their worlds in return for this guaranteed sustenance. A deep vibration shook the sanctuary, and through the blood connection, Ilara felt something like agreement. "It accepts," she breathed, amazed. "But the terms must be sealed with power. Power I don't possess alone." She turned to Dravius and Fenris, ancient enemies standing in the ruins of a corrupted pact. The original covenant was formed by the three races together: vampire, werewolf, and human. Only together can we forge a new one. Fenris stepped forward without hesitation. "The pact gives its strength." He drew a claw across his own palm, adding his blood to Ilara's spiraling column. Dravius hesitated, centuries of rule-making submission difficult, but as the walls around them disintegrated further and the Void Walker drifted closer, he made his choice. "The court gives its power." He bit into his wrist, allowing his ancient blood to join the crimson helix. The three bloods, human, werewolf, and vampire, twisted together, creating a strand of magic unlike anything seen for a millennium. Where the combined essence met the Void Walker, a new connection formed. Not a barrier of stolen energy, but a bridge of shared purpose. "By our blood, freely given," Ilara intoned, feeling the words rise from some ancestral memory. "We establish this covenant, protection for sustenance, balance for peace." The Void Walker's form contracted, then expanded. A gesture Ilara somehow understood as acceptance. The entity began to withdraw, the tear in reality slowly mending behind it. But before it disappeared completely, a tendril of darkness extended downward, touching Ilara's bleeding palm. Pain unlike anything she had ever experienced surged through her body. She screamed, collapsing as both Dravius and Fenris rushed to catch her. Darkness consumed her vision, and the last thing she heard was the Vampire King's desperate voice calling her name. Ilara awoke in a chamber she didn't recognize, lying upon a bed draped with silver-embroidered blue silk. Sunlight, actual sunlight, streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the stone floor. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed everything: the binding ceremony, the werewolf attack, the Void Walker. Then she saw the mark on her palm, a spiraling pattern of silver and black that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. The wound completely healed beneath this strange tattoo. "The Void Walker's seal," came a familiar voice. Ilara turned to find Helena Thornfield seated beside her bed, looking remarkably unperturbed for someone who had lived through the near destruction of their realm. "You're alive," Ilara said, relief flooding her. "What happened? How long have I been unconscious?" 3 days, Helena replied, helping Ilara sit up against the pillows. "And what happened, my dear, is that you've rewritten the laws of 3 worlds and somehow survived to tell about it." Her eyes crinkled with a mixture of pride and awe. "Not since Eliana herself has a Covenant Queen wielded such power, and even she didn't face down a Void Walker." Memories flooded back, the sanctuary collapsing, the 3 bloods joining, the cosmic entity accepting her terms. The castle, substantially damaged but already rebuilding itself, Helena assured her. "The magic here has always been semi-sentient. Once the new covenant was established, it began repairs immediately." "And the people of Ravenspire? The werewolves?" Helena's expression grew more serious. "That's a more complicated matter. Perhaps you should hear it from those more directly involved." She rose and moved to the door, opening it to reveal Dravius and Fenris waiting outside, an image so incongruous that Ilara blinked to ensure she wasn't hallucinating. The Vampire King entered first, his regal bearing somewhat diminished by obvious exhaustion. Gone was his battle armor, replaced by simpler attire of black and silver. Behind him, Fenris ducked to fit through the doorway, his massive form having returned to a more human appearance, still larger than any ordinary man, but with only subtle reminders of his werewolf nature in his golden eyes and sharpened canines. "Leave us," Dravius instructed Helena, who departed with a knowing smile that Ilara couldn't quite interpret. An awkward silence fell as the 3 architects of the new covenant regarded one another. "You should have died," Dravius finally said, his tone caught between accusation and amazement. "No human has ever survived direct contact with a Void Walker." "Perhaps I'm not entirely human anymore," Ilara replied, raising her marked palm. "Or perhaps they found me interesting enough to keep alive." Fenris snorted, a sound almost like laughter. "The little queen rewrites the rules of existence, then jokes about it 3 days later. Your father would be proud." The mention of her father brought a fresh pang of grief, but also clarity. "My father died trying to achieve what we've done," she said softly. "A covenant built on choice, not coercion." "A covenant that must now be implemented," Dravius added, pacing restlessly. "The terms you established require significant changes to how both our realms operate." "And Thornvale," Ilara said, suddenly remembering her village. "What's happened there? Do they know about the new covenant?" Dravius and Fenris exchanged uncomfortable glances. "There have been revelations," the Vampire King said carefully. "When the old covenant shattered, so did many of its effects, including the enchantments that kept certain knowledge from Thornvale's people. The villagers learned about the missing children." Fenris elaborated when Dravius hesitated. "About the elders' complicity, about your father's true fate." Ilara closed her eyes, imagining the chaos and pain such discoveries would cause. "And my mother? She leads them now," Fenris said, unexpected gentleness in his gruff voice. "When the truth emerged about the elders' betrayal, the village needed someone to trust. Margaret Blackwood stepped forward, revealing that she had suspected the truth for years, but had been magically prevented from speaking it. Relief washed over Ilara, followed by fierce pride. Of course, her mother would rise to such a challenge. Had she not prepared Ilara herself with both the dagger and the strength to use it if necessary? "And the servants here?" she asked, dreading the answer. "The transformed children," Dravius's expression grew haunted. "Some may be recoverable. The process can be reversed if it hasn't progressed too far. For others," he left the grim reality unspoken. "Then our first task under the new covenant is clear," Ilara declared, throwing aside the bed covers and standing despite her lingering weakness. "We must right the wrongs of the old one, beginning with those children and with Thornvale." "You speak as if your authority continues," Dravius observed, though without hostility. The binding ceremony was incomplete. Ilara raised her marked palm. "I bear the seal of a power greater than any of our ancestors encountered. I'd say that constitutes a binding of its own." Fenris smiled, showing pointed teeth. "She has you there, vampire." For the first time, Ilara saw Dravius, truly saw him. Not as the monstrous vampire king of village tales, nor as the manipulative ruler she had discovered, but as a being who had existed for millennia, bearing responsibilities she could scarcely comprehend. Ancient and powerful, yes, but also weary from centuries of maintaining a corrupt system he had inherited rather than created. "I'm not your enemy, Dravius," she said softly. "Nor is Fenris. Not anymore. The true threat lies beyond our realms, and only together can we keep it at bay." Something in the Vampire King's violet eyes shifted. A grudging respect, perhaps, or the first fragile tendrils of trust. "Then what do you propose, Covenant Queen?" "A council," Ilara answered without hesitation. "Equal representation from all three races, vampire, werewolf, and human. Transparent governance of the new covenant. No more secrets, no more stolen children." "And the Void Walkers?" Fenris asked. "The energy they require as payment for their forbearance?" Ilara looked down at her marked palm, where the spiral pattern seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. "I understand them now, at least better than before. They need life energy, but not in the quantities we feared. Small contributions from many, freely given, will satisfy them without harming any individual." "Freely given," Dravius repeated skeptically. "You believe people will volunteer, when the alternative is cosmic annihilation?" "Yes," Ilara smiled thinly. "But more importantly, when they understand it's a small price for true freedom. Freedom from werewolf attacks, from disease, from the constant fear that has ruled all our lives. I believe they will see the value in the exchange." The following weeks proved her right. As news of the new covenant spread, as the truth about the old one emerged, as the people of all three realms adjusted to a new reality, something unexpected happened. The centuries of enmity began to dissolve, replaced by cautious cooperation. Thornvale sent representatives to Ravenspire. Not trembling sacrifices, but proud ambassadors, with Margaret Blackwood at their fore. The werewolf packs established formal diplomatic ties with both human villages and vampire enclaves. And slowly, painfully, the transformed children who could be saved were returned to their families, while those beyond recovery were honored in ceremonies that finally acknowledged their unwilling sacrifice. Through it all, Ilara walked a delicate path as the cornerstone of the new covenant. The mark on her palm gave her unique insights into the Void Walker's needs and nature, allowing her to establish a system of energy contribution that harmed none while protecting all. Small amounts of life force, usually given in the form of blood, but sometimes in other ways, were collected from volunteers across all three races, then channeled through specially constructed monuments that served as feeding points for the cosmic entities. In return, the Void Walkers kept their distance, passing over their realms like shadows that acknowledged boundaries rather than threats seeking to devour all. 4 seasons passed, and on the anniversary of the Covenant's reforging, Representatives from all realms gathered in the restored Great Hall of Ravenspire. The celebration was like none before. Werewolves and vampires conversing civilly, humans moving among them without fear, music and laughter replacing centuries of suspicion. Ilara, dressed in a gown that incorporated symbols from all three cultures, found a moment of quiet on a balcony overlooking the enchanted forest. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Admiring your handiwork?" Dravius asked, joining her at the balcony rail. In the past year, the Vampire King had changed subtly but significantly, less isolated in his power, more engaged with the world beyond his court. "Wondering what my father would think," Ilara replied honestly, "if he would consider this worth his sacrifice." "He would be proud," came another voice, as Fenris emerged from the shadows, now comfortable enough in Ravenspire to move freely through its halls. "William Blackwood died seeking truth and justice. You've delivered both." Ilara smiled, touching the hilt of her father's sword, which she now wore ceremonially at formal functions. "And yet there's still so much to do, so many wounds to heal." "The work of generations," Dravius acknowledged. "But foundations matter, and you've built stronger ones than our ancestors managed." Above them, a shooting star traced a brilliant path across the night sky. Ilara raised her marked palm reflexively, feeling a distant acknowledgement from the Voidwalker currently passing through their realm, collecting its due before continuing its cosmic journey. "Do you regret it?" Dravius asked suddenly, his violet eyes studying her intently. "Coming to Ravenspire, becoming the Covenant Queen?" Ilara considered the question seriously. She thought of Thornvale, the village she could visit but never again call home due to the magical complexities of the new covenant. She thought of the responsibilities she now carried, the constant negotiations between ancient powers with centuries of grievances. She thought of the children still bearing scars, physical and emotional, from the old covenant's cruelties. But she also thought of the peace slowly blossoming between realms, the families reunited, the knowledge flowing freely where once there had been only fear and superstition, the marked decrease in suffering across all three peoples. "No," she answered finally. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, but not the outcome." Fenris chuckled, the sound rumbling in his broad chest. "Diplomatic as always, little queen." "Speaking of diplomacy," Dravius said, "there's the matter of the marriage portion of our covenant. The binding ceremony was never completed in the traditional sense." Ilara raised an eyebrow. "Are you proposing, Your Majesty?" The Vampire King actually looked discomfited, an expression she would have thought impossible on his aristocratic features a year earlier. "Merely raising a technical point that the Council will eventually address? The symbolic union of realms has traditionally been represented by—" "I know what it's been represented by," Ilara interrupted, amusement overtaking diplomacy. "And when I decide to marry, if I decide to marry, it will be for reasons beyond political expedience." "Of course," Dravius agreed hastily. Fenris made a sound suspiciously like a snort. A comfortable silence fell between the three architects of the new covenant, vampire, werewolf, and human, as they gazed out at the night sky together. Below them, the celebration continued, voices from all three realms mingling in harmony that would have been unthinkable a year before. Ilara felt the mark on her palm, warm slightly, a reminder of the cosmic forces that had shaped her fate. Yet for all the power it represented, for all the responsibility it entailed, she found herself at peace with her role. Not a sacrifice as she had once feared, not a victim of ancient plots, but a bridge between worlds, strong enough to bear the weight of history, flexible enough to allow for a different future. The Covenant Queen placed her hands on the balcony rail between her unlikely allies, the three of them forming their own small covenant in the starlight. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, and there would be many, they would face them together, bound not by coercion or fear, but by choice and shared purpose. And in that choice lay true power, more lasting than any magic forged in blood.